For the next draft of your speech, I want you to introduce an analogy into your argumentation. So this lecture is about how to discover analogies in your case, and also talking a little bit about the point of using an analogy. So, as it says here, something is only an analogy when it is used as evidence for the generalization of a rule of inference, whether that generalization is implicit or explicit. So, something being analogous isn't just that it's similar with respect to some quality about it. Things that are the same color are not analogous. We are only talking about an analogy when there's a certain kind of rule about how we would think about it that we take from one case to another case. And generally speaking, what we want to do is move from a case where that inference is clear, obvious, very accepted to the audience that we're imagining speaking to, into our own case, the case that we're concerned with, where it's less so. So I'm going to give you this made up fictional case in order for us to think about how we might discover various kinds of analogies within it. So imagine this case. A 6-year-old child, Julia, is diagnosed with terminal leukemia. She becomes a candidate for the Name Your Dream Foundation. She's a very devoted fan of the local sports hero Sookie Metz. After Julia communicates her wish that Sookie Metz pay her a hospital visit, Metz dies tragically in a plane crash. Her parents ask the foundation not to inform her of this, as it would be devastating, and perhaps even risk her health. They instead suggest hiring a look-alike to perform the visit. What should the organization do? People have many different intuitions about this case. I know because I've asked many different classes about it, and I've seen people argue it from many different perspectives. So first I want us to think about, from different points of view, what might be the kind of rule that we would use to describe the case. So, if we were to say that this is something like lying to a child, how could we then overcome that? Now, I'm trying to overcome a principle a way that I would describe it because I am imagining an audience that might be concerned with that. I want to try to overcome the doubts in my audience. So, many people would probably object to lying to a child. That sounds like something that would be bad. Are there analogous cases where lying to a child could be said to be good or indifferent? So here are two. Telling children Santa Claus is real. This is something that often comes up when people discuss this case. Sookie Metz is analogous to Santa Claus in this case. Well, what are the rules or the values or the principles that we use that justify telling children Santa Claus is real? Sometimes it's about joy, it's about the kind of hopefulness that the idea of Santa Claus brings to children. And even though in a certain sense it's a lie, we don't really usually relate to it that way. We think of it more as a myth, one that organizes cultural activities together for many people and allows for a certain kind of humility actually to be introduced. That parents, rather than claiming all of the gratitude for themselves, we all kind of contribute to the Santa Claus fund of hope and say these particular gifts at Christmas are from Santa Claus. Of course, not everyone celebrates Christmas. Not everybody will tell their children that Santa Claus is real. And people disagree with whether this is a good thing. But this is something that might come up. Or telling a child whose dog died that it went to a farm upstate. When things are really difficult is sometimes also when we lie to children. When a child's beloved pet dies or perhaps has to be euthanized, it's very difficult to have them understand why that is necessary, or very difficult for them to understand even the idea of death. And so in these cases, in order to soften reality, we also tell untruths in order to be compassionate in that moment to the feelings of the child and help them deal with it in order that in time they can come to understand the truth. So either of these cases might be used as analogous, yes, typical examples that people have intuitions about already that we could use in order to inform them in this case why what they might object to is nevertheless okay. um, let's say someone's coming from the opposite side, where what they would object to is telling children about violent or upsetting truths. Where are analogous cases that we want to find acceptable? One of these might be lying to adopted children about their adoption. I think most people would recognize that in such a situation, even if it might be comforting at a certain point to feel like you are um, part of a family in a way that makes sense to you, to have that fiction be held up through your whole life can lead to extremely disturbing experiences for people when they feel like they've been lied to their whole lives. So I would say that even though it might be a difficult conversation to happen between adoptive parents and their children, it's probably pretty important for them to know at some point that they have been adopted. Similar when an older relative dies or someone goes to prison. Sometimes in some families, someone goes to prison and there's the idea that um, your uncle went to college or something like that. I think that that probably leads certain children to lack trust in adults when inevitably they find out that that's not the case, or when they kind of wonder why other people's stories about going to college don't match their own families. They start to feel alienated and distrustful. So we might take these kinds of stories and say, this story is like this, the same rule applies, we should act in the similar way that we would act in this case. So in both of these cases, I've actually tried to find the rule or the inference that would go against my own position in order to find an analogy that would help people overcome it. I think that's probably the stronger way to come up with analogies as arguments for your own speeches. If you come up with an analogy of something that already appeals to the kind of inferences that an audience who would support your position would have, it probably is not going to add too much. So you want to think about analogies as something that help you overcome doubts, help you overcome questions that people have about their values in relationship to your position. And then lastly, here, we might think about doing this in a really kind of concrete way. So you might think about the various kinds of analogies, or sorry, the various kinds of relationships that are relevant in your case. So maybe you know these from tests. The A is to B, a C is to D form of the analogy, A is to B, C is to D. So often we get them in this kind of silly form that I don't think is very helpful. A poodle is to dog as a trout is to a, the answer is fish. But the idea here is the same as what we were doing before. The rule between poodle and dog is that a dog, sorry, a poodle is a kind of a dog, so a trout is a kind of a fish. Same thing here. Mason is to stone as carpenter is to wood, because the rule that holds between here these two is a relationship that masons work on stone as carpenters work on wood. And so what these versions of analogies show us is the way that a relationship can be thought about as a rule that is brought into a new term in order to discover the kind of hidden term there. So the same thing we can do with the elements of our case here. Julia is to Suki Metz as we are to what? Well, in this case, it's not so obvious. Okay, obviously I'm referring back to the fictional case here. What is the relationship between Julia and Suki Metz? That can be described in lots of different ways. We could say that Suki Metz is Julia's hero, or we could say Suki Metz is actually a stranger to Julia. And so it kind of depends on what we want to say. And then when we draw this analogy out to, let's say, the audience, to us, who are our heroes? All of our heroes people that are real? Is that what we want from a hero? That it has to be kind of a real, actual person? Or maybe we'll say something like, who, if we think about the relationship between Julia and Suki Metz as the relationship, a parasocial relationship, this is like someone's relationship to a pop star or a sports icon, anybody's relationship. Okay. Same thing here. What's the Name Your Dreams Foundation's relationship to Julia's parents? You could say this is a relationship of support. You could say this is a relationship of duty or obligation. You could say that they are there to help Julia's parents grieve, or that they're really not there for Julia's parents. They're really there for Julia herself. And so again, taking different terms that are relevant to your argumentation, thinking of what the relationship is between them will allow you to discover new analogies in your own case. That's pretty much it for this lecture. And if you're having trouble finding some analogies or where analogies would be helpful in your case, please feel free to contact me and I'll help you work through it.